Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I'm Vice President for the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular weekly update of what's going on in our state's capital, rather, as they work through the legislative session. So we are now in week 7, or for those keeping count, it's the 48th legislative day of a scheduled 105-day session. And so we have passed the next cutoff date that the legislature sets in order to organize their work to go from 1,500 or 2,000 bills down to the few hundred that will probably be passed in the end and sent on to the governor for his signature. And that latest cutoff date just happened on February 24th, and that was the deadline for bills to pass out of fiscal committee. So that's Ways and Means Budget Committee. The thing is, these are internal rules, so those deadlines are not actually hard and fast, and there are bills that technically didn't make the deadline, but could still be live and be brought back later in the session. But I have 5 bills I'm going to go through really quickly that we think are the most important ones that will affect the lives of people in our state if they end up getting passed, or some of them, which we consider to be bad policy ideas that would hurt the people of our state, and we're beginning to get an assessment about whether those bills have died for the year. So the first one, which would affect everybody, is HB 1832. This is a bill that would impose a mileage tax on the 5.7 million licensed drivers in Washington state. This idea of a mileage or per mile tax, or sometimes it's called a road usage charge, has been around for many years. It is being pushed ardently by the Department of Transportation and the Democrats in the legislature and the governor. The main problem that they are running into is that the general public tends to hate this idea as soon as they hear about it. People are very suspicious of paying a per mile tax. And they're also concerned about privacy issues with the government is going to track where you're going, how many miles you've driven. And there are various mechanisms for reporting your mileage and then paying a tax on that. So this is the first bill that we've seen that would make this a real idea. Of course, based on what I just described, the Democrats are taking a step-by-step approach. So HB 1832 would create a mileage tax, but get this, it would be voluntary. So you could choose to enroll in this program, pay 2.5 cents per mile, report your odometer reading to the state. You would get a credit back based to make up for the gas tax, and the government would calculate what the credit is. So you begin to see that some people might pay more, some people might pay less. There are also electric vehicle owners who pay an annual fee, but if they voluntarily join this odometer program, then they would not have to pay the annual fee. They would pay the mileage tax instead. So this is a pilot program. I looked up what the average miles driven by people in Washington state is. According to federal data, that's about 11,000 miles a year. You calculate that with the 2.5 cents, and you come up with about $275 in tax that you would pay a year. And guess what? That's what state officials think that most people pay roughly in gas taxes right now, around $200 to $300 a year. So they clearly back calculated this so that the per mileage tax would about equal what they think people are paying in gas taxes right now. Of course, that's just to get it started. So the program would be voluntary, as I mentioned, but on January 1st, 2030, the program would become mandatory for everybody. And that is also the date that the governor has signed legislation a year or two ago, ending the sale of gas-powered cars in Washington state. So you see that these two policy ideas would come together. I'm sure this is by design, that the sale of gas-powered cars would end at the same time that the state is shifting to a mandatory per-mile tax. Again, this is all a pilot program. We'll see how it works. Where the bill stands now is it was heard in a hearing in the House Transportation Committee. This hearing got so much attention that the committee delayed it twice. So our expert, Charles Prestrud, traveled to Olympia twice to testify on this bill. He finally was able to do it a third time when they held this hearing, but hundreds, if not more, people also signed in to testify. And this makes lawmakers very nervous. It also got a lot of immediate attention. So I was doing interviews on the evening news. Charles was doing media as well. The point being that as word trickles out and people begin to hear that a mileage tax is going from concept to pilot program, lawmakers are starting to hear resistance to that and a lot of real concerns. One concern that we mentioned is that right at the time when you would be reporting your mileage to the government is exactly when public trust in public institutions is at the lowest point possibly ever. So just at the time that you're being asked to hand your travel data over to the Department of Transportation is the same time that people are, for a variety of reasons, are very suspicious of what the government is doing. And then there was a little provision buried down in the bill that most people wouldn't notice, and that is that the bill specifically asks state officials to request that automobile manufacturers report the mileage in the cars that they have sold. So if a car has a GPS tracker and the auto manufacturer is able to track where that car is being driven, this is after it is sold, after you own it. It's possible that car manufacturers would report that mileage to the government every year. Again, this is a proposal in the bill. State officials are asked to look into this. That doesn't necessarily mean that it would happen, but it shows that it's an idea that they're thinking about. So we'll keep tracking that. The next bill that I'll report on is HB 1720. There's very good news about this bill because it is a voluntary stream buffer bill that primarily impacts people in Eastern Washington. What the state has been doing over the last couple of years is pressuring landowners, farmers, ranchers, other owners who have streams and creeks and waterways on their property that they would be forced to put aside strips of land on both sides to provide shade and protection for fish. They were coming up with arbitrary sizes for the buffer zone, 50 feet wide, 100 feet wide. And of course, property owners were expressing a lot of concern about this. Regarding agriculture, it would have taken thousands of acres of land out of food production and create a problem with inflation and rising food costs. HB 1720 takes a completely different approach. It's a voluntary program. The landowner would propose projects to the State Department of Ecology about protecting streams on a person's land. If that project is approved, the landowner would receive a grant to compensate for the property that he is voluntarily giving up for environmental protection. So those three principles are why we support this bill. It's voluntary. Projects are bottom up. They're proposed by citizens to the government as a way to protect fish and the environment. And then thirdly, it provides compensation for private taking. So that approach we support much more. This bill has bipartisan support. It was passed in committee and has now been sent to the Capital Budget Committee, and that's the next step in the process. The third issue to cover, again, another piece of good news, is a bill that I testified on, SB 5209, which would have required mandatory voting in Washington state. So in other words, we would be the first state in the country to have a law that says you are required to cast a ballot in every single election. And in fact, the ballot would have printed on it an instruction that says you are required by law to submit this ballot. We think this is an outrageous violation of democracy because choosing to not vote is part of the right to vote. And that's what analysis that we presented to the committee. When I testified on that, the bill did pass the State Government Elections Committee. It made the deadline for passing out of committee, but then an interesting thing happened. The Senate leadership sent the bill to the Rules Committee, and there it sits. So we're beginning to think that this bill has been sent on a dead-end track and hopefully will not be scheduled for full Senate action, but we shall see. It's never over until the legislature adjourns, so we'll see what happens there. Fourth bill that I'll talk about is SB 5020. This was a proposal from Senator Lisa Wellman, who's a Democrat from Mercer Island. She is the chair of the Senate K-12 and Higher Education Committee. And this bill would lower the mandatory age for a child to go to school from age 8 to age 6. This bill, again, created enormous opposition. Lee Finna on our staff testified against it. She presented data that shows that there's no automatic relationship between developmental age and the age at which a child should go to school. She also pointed out that that decision should be made by parents, and that is exactly the testimony that the committee heard from a range of parents. Homeschooling parents are in particular opposed to this idea. The entire concept of homeschooling is that parents direct the education of their children, and this bill takes that away. The supporters of the bill, including Senator Wellman, pointed out that other states 46 other states, have a lower mandatory school age, usually age 6. And that therefore Washington State was, quote, behind, was the way that she put it. And one mom, when she testified, addressed this question, and she said, wait a minute, it's not necessarily that Washington State is behind other states. Maybe they're behind us, because the more progressive idea is to allow parents to make decisions. So she said that Washington State is actually ahead in the idea of loosening the age of school attendance and allowing the family to make a decision. Rumor that we are hearing is that homeschoolers alone have, quote, killed the bill. And the reason is because this is the second time that Senator Wellman has made this attempt. Last year, the bill failed. Now it looks like the bill will fail again. The maneuver seems to be that she passed it out of her own committee. It was a partisan vote. Every Republican voted against it. Only Democrats voted in favor of it. We have to assume that because Senator Wellman controls the committee, that she knew that was going to be the outcome. But instead of the Senate leadership scheduling the bill for Senate action, they rerouted it to another committee. So they sent it to the Ways and Means Committee. We're not quite sure what jurisdiction it has, but we think this is an internal maneuver in order to let Senator Wellman have credit for passing the bill out of her committee, but then send it to another jurisdiction so it actually goes nowhere. And we'll see what ultimately happens with that. Last issue that I'll cover here is HB 1839. This is very topical, introduced by Representative Tomiko Santos, a Democrat. And what this bill would do would be to limit the length of freight trains that pass through Washington State. And what she is doing is responding to the accident that happened in East Palestine, where there was a derailment and a huge ecological disaster. The pushback that she's getting, in kind of common sense, is there's really no relationship between the derailment and the length of the train. She claims that this is going to add to public safety. We're now finding out that the derailment in Ohio happened because of an overheated wheel bearing. And so making the train shorter wouldn't have any effect on that, but it would drive up prices, lead to supply chain problems, contribute to inflation, and our main concern, take away the flexibility of a railroad to manage its own trains in an effective way. The other thing about this bill is we see it as emblematic of what the legislature does all the time, and that is create solutions that have no relation to the problem that they're talking about. So this is very typical of what bills do. It's kind of grandstanding. Representative Tomiko Santos was to say she's doing something about train safety, rail safety. Great. Then you read the text of her bill. Turns out it's not related to that at all. So we're hoping that this bill doesn't go anywhere, and we'll see what happens next. So those are the main issues that I'm going to hit. Regarding the schedule coming up, I'm going to mention that Todd Myers on our staff, our environmental expert, has written a book I think you all know about called Time to Think Small. And he's been invited to speak at MIT. He was there last week in Boston talking about environmental science and the ideas in his book. And then on Tuesday, he was invited to speak at Whitworth College as a guest lecturer at their senior class seminar. And then on March 7th, he'll be back on the East Coast at Harvard speaking at a government class there, again, about his book, Time to Think Small. The reason we're excited about these great speaking engagements is that it fulfills our message of getting free market ideas on college campuses. And secondly, Todd has a very common sense, data-driven approach to environmental protection. And his primary message and the finding in his book is that individual decisions made based on technology and free market forces are far more effective at protecting the environment than arbitrary goals that are being set by the government. Todd has been able to point out that every benchmark that Washington State has set, every environmental benchmark that Seattle has set, has been missed over the last 20 years or so. So he's trying to move decision-making to individuals as being much more effective. He has a quote, his talks are to show why political solutions are not working and why markets do it better when it comes to protecting the environment. And with that, events we have coming up are the start of our legislative breakfast series that will be in Moses Lake on March 1st. Our great Palm Springs event, which always sells out every year, is coming up on Saturday, March 4th. And then later on in March is our YP Young Professionals midwinter midwinter social event that's in Bellevue on March 16th. And as always, you can keep up with all the latest issues that we're working on by going to washingtonpolicy.org and clicking on the blog tab. And our researchers are posting information there every day on what we're working on. And that's a great way to keep up. And with that, I will be back next time. Thanks.